Hello everyone, welcome back to Field Biology. Today we're going to be talking about freshwater wetlands and specifically pond succession, which is how ponds change over time and how the plant communities and animal communities that are in them change. First, we have to talk a little bit about ecological succession. Ecological succession is how communities of plants and animals change over time, either after a disturbance or as an area is being newly pollinated by life. So you always have a different kind of plant that dominates during the different stages of succession. You start off with things like weeds and grasses that are the first things to come into a new area. Then over time, shrubs can establish themselves, and then you might end up with young shade-loving trees coming in underneath the shrubs. They then grow up and dominate, and then eventually over time you end up with a climax community, which could be dominated by things like a mature oak and hickory forest, as in this example. All of these things are what could happen, for instance, after a field is no longer farmed. So if a field is just left to lay fallow and not farmed anymore, then this is what's going to start happening. That field is going to undergo succession. This is an example from a terrestrial ecosystem. What we're going to talk about today is what happens in an aquatic ecosystem, how that changes over time as the pond goes through succession. So first off, a pond starts off pretty deep. Light can't reach the bottom, and so there's very little plant growth. That's called the pioneer stage. So the plants and the animals that are dominating are phytoplankton and zooplankton. It's microscopic plant and algae, little crustaceans, zooplankton. That's all that you can really find in this stage because the pond is deeper and light can't get all the way to the bottom. Then, over time, sediment builds up on the bottom. And as the pond gets shallower, you end up with light being able to reach the bottom of the pond. This starts what's called the submergent vegetation stage. It's called that because, as you can see, all of the vegetation is submerged underneath the pond. At this stage, you get plants like stonewort, waterweed, hornwort, all these kinds of submerged vegetation. And the animals that are dominating are things like crayfish, mayflies, damselflies, dragonflies, and all sorts of aquatic macroinvertebrates and invertebrates that can live on this submerged vegetation. Again, as years pass, the plants that were there start to decay and more sediment builds up, so the pond becomes even more shallow. In this situation, you now have plants that emerge out of the water, as you see in this picture. And you have some floating plants like water lilies. You have cattails and rushes and sedges. So this is called the emergent vegetation stage because the vegetation is emerging out of the water. You'll also get a lot more animals like bluegill that are feeding on the crustaceans, the mayflies, everything we were talking about in the one before. And you end up with frogs, toads, turtles, that kind of thing because you have a bigger established plant community. So you have more animals that are able to survive in that habitat. Then over time, as the pond continues to fill up, the open expanse of water disappears and you end up with more of a marsh. This is what we have going on slowly out in a pond that we're going to actually go to see tomorrow when we go outside. As the sediment builds up, the open expanses of water disappear, and you end up getting maybe a few trees start to grow. As the area of land becomes drier, it's called a Carr. And then as trees start to grow and dominate, it becomes a swamp. So this would be an example of a freshwater wetland swamp where you don't have standing water anymore, but you still have maybe moist soil and it's dominated by trees. The animals that dominate this are salamanders, frogs, still maybe some turtles, and you'll get the adult insects that will come in at this point. This is the final stage for this, a swamp, and then over time, if it continues to dry out, it would become a forest. Now, this only happens if a pond doesn't have any water sources coming into it. If you have new water sources coming in all the time, you're obviously going to have new water inputs all the time, and so therefore it's never going to completely dry up. So we're going to see ponds in different stages of succession when we go out on our hike tomorrow. So make sure you are ready for that. See you guys tomorrow.